Hello, everyone, and welcome to ScreenWorks. I'm John Riarte, curator of digital programs at the Photographers Gallery in London. ScreenWorks is a program of fortnightly live streams, events launched by Fotomuseum Winterthur in Switzerland and the Photographers Gallery in London, with support by Pro Helvetia. My colleague Marco De Mutis, digital curator in the Winterthur Fotomuseum, and I started ScreenWorks in April 2020 as a way to respond to the pandemic, as well as to keep exploring the possibilities of the network image. Every 2 weeks, we invite artists, researchers, or curators to take over our screens and to visit the spaces where their artistic practice takes place and share the work process behind it. Each event has a different format and takes the audience into a particular digital space. Some ScreenWorks have been quite performative, others have turned into collaborative online happenings, or have taken us behind the screen of the artist's practice. If you have missed any of our previous events, please visit our website, screenworks.com, or our YouTube channel to watch the recordings of them. Some housekeeping information now. Your microphone should be muted to avoid noise disturbances. If that's not the case, please mute them now. And as I just mentioned, we are recording and we will be archiving this event, so please turn off your cameras if you don't want to be recorded. Please use the public chat to send any question to Sheung, or alternatively to send a private message to Marco or to myself.
And hi from me as well. I'm Marco De Mutis, digital curator at Fotomuseum Winterthur. Today we'll be taken on a walk on the screen of visual artist and researcher Sheung Yiu. The artist will lead a performative exploration of his project Ground Truth through a journey across folders and subfolders, among archival images, photographic artworks, exhibition documentation, as well as scientists' datasets. Throughout his performative presentation, you will follow the complicated relationship between image technologies and scientific truth, taking us to the Finnish forests and meticulously trying to measure trees and verify what we see. There will be accompanying scientists equipped with the computational and hyperspectral imaging systems, setting out to approach the boundaries of satellite imaging in the forests of Finland. Ultimately, though, the talk will explore deeper and philosophical questions behind scientific and technological ways of seeing, and the role of the image today. How can we see the invisible? And what is the relation between what we see and what is there? Between technologies of seeing and our perception and surroundings. Finally, how can it be that the more technology develops, the more abstract seeing becomes? Sheung Yiu is a Hong Kong-born, image-centered artist and researcher based in Helsinki. His artwork explore the act of seeing through algorithmic models and sense-making through networks of images. His research interests concern the increasing complexity and agency of computer-generated imagery in contemporary digital culture. He looks at photography through the lens of new media, scales, and network thinking. Dear Sheung, thank you so much for being here with us today, and thanks for taking us on this journey. The screen is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, John and Marco, for the invitation, and thanks for the audience for coming to this screen walk. I'll now share my screen and take you on a virtual tour of the dataset. To preface this, I want to give you an introduction to what I've been doing. In 2019, I followed a group of remote sensing scientists into the forest in the middle of Finland. I joined their field trip as a visual artist interested in algorithmic ways of seeing. In my work, I explore how computation and photography interact with each other. So the text that follows is my reflection on a specific moment during the field trip. It's a moment in which I took a portrait of researcher Daniel, who was taking a ground truth measurement on the forest floor using a terrestrial laser scanner. In today's presentation, I'll take you on a tour through my folders of photos and the data sets given to me by scientists to tell the story about how to see something where there's nothing. So here it is, how to see something where there's nothing. Landscape, forest, tree, twigs, needle, pixel. If we keep zooming in on a digital image, not before long, we'll reach a pixel. A pixel is a block of color of nothing, a set of RGB values, and the resolution limit of a digital optical device. We begin with a picture taken 786 kilometers away from the ground, a satellite image of a Finnish forest. More specifically, the image is taken by the Sentinel-2 satellites, which orbit the Earth regularly, taking images of the same 290 kilometer strip of land at the same local time. The satellite sample 13 spectral bands from visible light to near-infrared wavelengths. Each band has different spatial resolution. 4 bands at 10 meter, 6 bands at 20 meter, and 3 bands at 60 meters spatial resolution. At a scale of 290 kilometer, in a spectral band at 10 meters spatial resolution, each pixel on the image represents a 10 meter by 10 meter area on Earth. Anything smaller than the spatial resolution cannot be resolved on an image. In other words, the pixel contains a tree, but the tree is invisible on the image. Here is where human vision ends, but where the story of seeing something where there's nothing begins. The Sentinel satellites record images of multiple spectrums, from high-resolution optical photographs to radar and infrared imaging. The sensors dissect the Earth into multiple electromagnetic spectrums. Each has its own visibilities and invisibilities. Optical light is natural to the human eye, but is easily obstructed by the Earth's atmosphere. Infrared light is sensitive to the photosynthetic surfaces, but has a poor spatial resolution. Researchers switch between different data layers, triangulating useful information from complementary spectrums. I like to think of remote sensing as a vision escaping the human body. The sensorial organ expands to a distributed global network, escapes the visual cortex into algorithms. Images are no longer confined to the humanly perceptible, but the machine readable. Landscape. Eames Brothers' classic film Power of 10 started from 1 meter above a man lying on his picnic blanket. The video slowly zooms out. On the third frame, 100 meters above ground, the man becomes a dot. And on the fourth frame, the man disappears into the image. Each progression from the idle grass field to the final frame 100 million light years away contains a man, yet we can no longer see him. He's there, but he cannot be resolved. After 10 to the power 24, the video took an opposite direction, zooming back in.
3, 2, 1. We are back at our starting point. We slow up at 1 meter, 10 to the 0 power.
We are quickly brought back to the human scale. Then a close-up of his hand, then skin cells, before entering the atomic scales. The zooming in reminds us that the original frame also contains the atom, yet they cannot be resolved. In a similar way, the man is not visible in an image 100 million light years away. There's always something where there's nothing to see on an image. That something is invisible because we are looking at the wrong scale. The size of each frame in Eames' frame is the same, yet they communicate different scales. Size is not the same as scale. The nanoscale can be as small as the head of a pin or as large as a galaxy. Its spatial extension is arbitrary. What marks it as a nanoscale is a typical or characteristic size domain of its entities and dynamics. The nanoscale is a domain in which features measured in nanometers can be resolved as individual entities. Because maps are fundamentally limited in the amount of detail they can produce, scale expresses this trade-off between size and resolving power. A digital image is also a map. It is a map of quantized values, which occasionally form meaningful patterns that human recognizes. So the story of seeing something where there's nothing is essentially a story of seeing across different scales and finding the right balance between size and resolving power. It is a story about overcoming resolution limit. Force. 3 meters away from me, Daniel was looking up. Daniel Schrage always looked up at the forest canopy. He was observing how much light was falling onto the forest floor and how much the trees are swaying in the wind. He needed the forest to be at an absolute standstill to get a sharp scan. He was doing a ground truth measurement. The machine he used to capture the forest does not have the fast shutter of a camera. He was standing next to a terrestrial laser scanner. Terrestrial laser scanning is a remote sensing measuring device that creates dense point cloud of the observed object. It is a state-of-the-art standard for vegetation monitoring. The machine emits a laser beam towards a target and detects the reflected beam. The scanner measures the time needed for the laser beam to travel, computes the distance between the target and the object, and creates an XYZ coordinate of one point of the scene. The machine repeats the process until it finishes scanning the whole scene. The result is an assemblage of points, a point cloud, which represents the 3D space. Each scan takes a couple of minutes to complete, so it is crucial that the forest is at a standstill. Otherwise, the point cloud would be recording the movement rather than the space. The slightest movement would create a smudge in the scan, noise in the data. I adjusted my shutter speed. He waited for the wind to stop. On the other hand of the 3 meters distance, I looked straight ahead with my camera pointing at Daniel. I looked at him unaware of any breeze but the swarms of mosquito on this humid summer night. I set my camera shutter to 1/60th of a second for this wide portrait, or maybe even slower. Add as much light into the camera in this dim environment. I know that if Daniel stood relatively still, the shutter speed should be enough to freeze him in the frame so that I could get a crisp portrait of him. Just as how swaying trees create a smudge in the scan, motion blur could be a source of noise to a photograph. On that summer night, Daniel and I were standing on a forest plot at Hyttiala Fuel Station in the middle of Finland. We were observing from ground level for different reasons. Daniel Schreck belongs to a team of remote sensing researchers. He told me the official aim of his research is to develop a better interpretation model for multi-sensor satellite forestry image. Remote sensing is the acquisition of information about a physical environment without on-site observation. Orbiting the Earth, satellites collect a variety of data from surface temperature to vegetation coverage through multispectral sensors. The network of satellites forms a planetary sensorial system that monitors the Earth in real time. Daniel and I are not only working in different timescales, we are seeing the landscapes from opposite directions. My camera collects light reflected from the scene, traveled through optical lens, and focused onto my negatives. When I say I see a tree, I'm describing my perception of light as a result of the interaction among humans, the sun, the tree, and other agents. This interaction is often explained by a mental picture of light rays shooting into my eyes. It is a mental picture of objects that can be traced back, for example, to the beginning of Western civilization. Ancient Greek philosophers, Democritus and Epicurus, hypothesized that objects cast off resemblance of themselves, eidola, into human eyes, much like how snakes shed their skins. The intromission theory concretizes the direction of visual sensory input from the environment inward into the human body. In the forest, around 2 kilometers from the field station, Daniel is operating a terrestrial laser scanner. He's scanning the forest to obtain a point cloud, a 3D representation of the forest. He does one scan for he's scanning the forest to obtain a point cloud, and he does one scan every 10 meters apart and repeats the process 16 times to cover the whole plot. He needed the data to understand how forests reflect light. He's building a forest reflectance model. Pay close attention to how the forest looks like at heights below 2 meters, i.e. understory trees, bushes, and anything else that might occlude targets. Earlier in the day, he set up targets in the forest systematically, so he could use the target to stitch 16-point clouds into a whole forest plot. To see what is hidden underneath the pixel, one has to reverse engineering the act of seeing. Conventional camera works in a forward direction. from scene to image. But if we have complete knowledge about how light travels through the forest, bouncing between leaves and finally reaches the camera, we can trace light step by step to recreate the original scene. In other words, if we have a model, we can see in reverse. Reverse seeing is not a new concept. It is simply forgotten. In ancient Greece, as a competing theory to intromission theory, the pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles believed that light emanates from our eyes and touches the objects we see, giving us sight. In science, reverse seeing is formulated as an inverse problem, a subset of mathematical questions that deduces from a set of observation its causes. The direct problem of seeing is overtly familiar. Owing to the millennia-long love affair with images, the ability to picture how a scene will be rendered on the surface, let's say paper, canvas, or a metal plate, is almost an instinctive understanding nowadays. An inverse problem of seeing means a reversal in this reasoning. Can we reconstruct the whole scene from a surface, even the parts that were lost in the act of picturing and escaped resolution limits? Scientists believe that the inverse problem of seeing can be solved if we have adequate information about the actors in the scene and their interactions. In the case of remote sensing a forest, sunlight, trees, and their interactions are the necessary informational pieces to complete a reflectance model. Building a helpful model involves meticulous measurements of trees and the physical structure. From physical structure to optical properties of leaves, which differ from species to species. Tree. Around a 10-meter radius at every 60-degree interval, Daniel set up a terrestrial laser scanner. In the center of the circle is a tree ceiling, propped up against a square white background. A forest is made up of thousands and thousands of trees, and each twigs affects how sunlight is scattered and reflected back to space. Switching from the scale of a forest to that of a tree, Daniel carefully recorded the 3D structure of a tree, one of the first steps of building a forest reflectance model. Twig, needle. Needle 1. 2.33997373 cm is the length of the first needle measured. After recording the 3D structure, Daniel and his colleagues broke down the tree into needles and twigs, plugging and weighing them one by one. With the help of a scanner and computer software, they computed the length and surface area of the tree's component. The data help establish a correlation between the tree 3D structure and its photosynthetic area. Needle, twigs. The Lagos goniometer in the remote sensing lab of University of Zurich is a measuring device 4 meters in diameter. This device is capable of measuring spectral data from all view angles over the atmosphere. Daniel's colleagues Arne Hovey places a ceiling in the middle of the device to measure spectral information of the tree at different levels, from the whole tree to twigs and individual leaves. In other words, he's recording the interaction of light with the biochemical, physical, and physiological features of a tree. A dataset composed of multi-angular spectral libraries and auxiliary data at tree, leaf, needle, and bark level for 3 common European tree species. Daniel's colleagues, Arne Hovey, is doing a measurement. He recorded his measurements rigorously, how he recorded it, and what he recorded. To illuminate the trees, we used a 1,000 watt brightness stabilized tungsten halogen lamp that generated a conical light beam, opening angle of approximate 22 degrees. We used an ASD Field Spec 3 non-imaging spectrometer, serial number 16006, which measured in the wavelength range of 350 to 2,500 nanometer and outputted spectra at 1 nanometer interval. The canvas had directional hemispherical reflectance factor of 0.013 to 0.02. This ensured a well-controlled and predictable background signal, stray light, in parentheses, which could be later removed in the data processing. After the spectral measurements, red, green, blue photographs of the tree were taken in the same 24 view angles as used for the spectral measurements. To avoid saturation of the photographs, exposure time was manually set for each azimuth by underexposing the white background by 0.7 exposure stops, using built-in light meter in the camera. End of notes. Landscape. 1.2 kilometers above ground, a plane took hyperspectral images and laser scans of Hutiara. The hyperspectral image has 48 bands. Each representing the landscape scene in 48 different frequencies of electromagnetic waves. The hyperspectral image show how much light entering the forest is reflected back to space. On the other hand, the laser scan or LiDAR shows the 3D structure of the forest. With information about the height of the tree and the area of canopy cover, scientists can deduce the biomass of the forest. The triangulation data from leaf spectra to tree point clouds, from needle weights to landscape hyperspectral images, reveals a set of mathematical correlations between the light waves recorded by satellites and the feature of the forest. A theoretical reflectance model describes how forest interacts with light. Like a conversion table, it translates wavelength and signal intensity to tree heights and canopy area. With enough information, the model promises the power to visualize the forest from a pixel of data. If Forens' reflectance model sounds like an obscure technique of the algorithmic age, it does not. It is one of the many inventions to extract the maximum amount of details and information from photographs. The discipline goes back as early as the 50s or even earlier under the name of photo interpretation and photogrammetry. A photo interpreter uses knowledge of scales, perspectives, and optics to determine the shape and size of images observed and captured in aerial photographs. A stereoscopic pair of aerial photographs, that is, photographs of the same scene taken from slightly different angles, make use of the parallax effect to give the illusion of depth. Using a stereoscope, photo interpreters observe objects on the image in 3 dimensions and distinguish close from distance object. With a bit of information about scale of the map and field measurement, photo interpreters can convert the diameter of a tree crown on the photograph to its size, or the length of tree shadows to its height, switching between an aerial view and on-site observations. Photo interpreters develop conversion tables, formulas, algorithms, rulers for transscalar seeing. Landscape 2. 189 kilometers away from Hyttala in the Library of University of Arts, Helsinki, I found a landscape photo guidebook titled The Art of Scenic Photography. The book is written by 2 professional landscape photographers from the United States. It details photographic principles to capture the beauty of the natural scenery of US National Park. Occasionally, the photographers share philosophy of the art. Light in and of itself has no meaning. By making choices and appropriate manipulations, the photographer instills the necessary meaning into light, the alphabet of photography. In a sense, the artistic photographer's role is that of an interpreter. Today, many photographers considered extreme sharpness of detail to be an absolute requirement of a good scenic photograph. This bias is a result of many years during which the best-known landscape photographers felt that personal interpretations of outdoor scenery could be conveyed best if the image were as sharp as camera technology could permit. Specifically, the group F64 photographers of the early 1930s establishes the standard by which many people still judge outdoor photographs. Remote sensing has forest reflectance models. Photography has its own system. The scientists deconstruct trees into pieces to weigh every needle. The photographers dissect the natural scene into gray zones to achieve an optimal tonal range in an image. Photographing in a forest. Light that reaches the forest floor unobstructed, it's so much brighter than surrounding shadows that any film's exposure latitude will be exceeded. As a result, if the camera is set to an exposure that will record highlight details, everything else records as black blotches. If the exposure is set to record shadows, highlight areas wash out. In either case, the result is a muddled image that does not do justice to the scene. The model photographers have converts a natural scene into a detailed landscape photograph. The model remote sensing researchers have converts light waves back into a tree. Forest. The scanning cover a 50-meter by 50-meter plot of forest. When the scanning finished, Daniel showed me the resulting image on the scanner viewer. The collection of red dots of different shades depicts trees and undergrowth of the forest floor. I understood immediately that I was looking at a 3D representation of the forest. For Daniel, the point cloud is a raw material for building a better interpretation model. Daniel collects ground truth data. With satellite data and comparing ground truth data with satellite data, his team establishes the mathematical correlation, a model that translates ground level vision to extraterrestrial vision. I was looking at an image, he was building a model. Photo theorist John Tech said, realism is a social practice of representation, an overall form of discursive production, a normality which allows a strictly delimited range of variations. Daniel's point cloud, the laser scanner that produces it, the field trip we took to capture it, and the research funding that supports it belongs to a social practice of representation, data realism. Data realists believe that data is a proxy of our lived reality. Data realism is sustained by computational models. Models improve with more data and rigorous measurement. The point cloud of the forest is only one piece of the puzzle for the reflectance model. Daniel measured the physical structure of a tree. His colleagues cataloged the spectral properties of tree shoots. Each data point helps formulate the mathematical correlation between what is on the ground and what is recorded in satellite multispectral images. Thousands of data points made up a reflectance model. A model enables reverse seeing, the ability to predict a 3D forest from a 2D satellite image. In data realism, models become nature itself. This is the final chapter. Daniel and I are looking in opposite directions. I look forward with my optical lens. I look through the viewfinder at him. I press the shutter, already having a good idea of how the photograph would turn out. Daniel looks backward with his model. He began with the data from a satellite image. Using forest reflectance model and ground truth data, he worked backwards to decipher the original scene that created the image. Our ability to collect and discern data promises the power to resurrect a tree from a pixel. At that moment, do I see a tree? Or am I seeing something where there's nothing? Daniel's point cloud the laser scanner that produces it, the field trip we took to capture it, and the research funding that supports it belongs to another social practice of representation, data realism. Different from photographic realism, data realists believe that data is a proxy of our lived reality. Data realism is sustained by computational models, models improved with more data and rigorous measurements. The point cloud of the forest is only one piece of the puzzles for the reflectance model. Daniel measures the physical structure of the forest. His colleagues catalog the spectral properties of tree shoots. Each data point helps formulate the mathematical correlation between what is on the ground and what is recorded in the satellite's multispectral data. Thousands of data points make up a reflectance model, which lets scientists infer features of the forest from satellite images. In data realism, models become nature itself. Thank you very much. Before I end the presentation, I want to give a special thanks to Mitch Sinove for creating the CGI for the video that you're seeing now. And then I want to also give special thanks to Associate Professor Mina Rautiainen and the researcher Daniel Schreck, Anne Hovey, and Petri Forsström for the research project. From the research project From Needle to Landscape, a novel approach to scaling forest spectra, for working with me and generously giving me the data that they collected. So yeah, thank you very much.
And thank you very much also from our side, Sheung. This has been a very wonderful, poetic, but also challenging and political journey through your folders and through these very different ways of seeing and interpreting reality. While we now want to open up the floor for questions, maybe we can also already start a little bit of a discussion. I wanted just to go back to this idea of data realism, which sounds really fascinating because especially going through, like the journey that you created for us, it looks like we're looking at the same, or like we're still looking at images, and images that are very photographic. But at the same time, it looks like it's really a 180-degree shift in terms of like the mindset of interpreting these images, right? I wasn't sure if you were tracing sort of a history of how, like photography becomes information through the early photogrammetry, and how did we basically reach this moment in which the model and the prediction is already creating the nature and reality itself. Maybe if you could elaborate a little bit about, like this kind of relationship and this history of the image also and the camera.
Yes, I think nowadays it's almost common sense to understand that a digital image contains information. And as I mentioned in the presentation, a digital image is a map of quantized value, and the pattern that it made might not make sense, but may coincidentally become something that human can recognize and understand. But then I also thought of that the history of information extraction is also not particularly new specifically to digital images. It can trace back to, let's say, the military history of photo interpretation and military reconnaissance. And that's why I included that part, this manual that I got from the Finnish library, which given away for free. And just to look at the history of this kind of more analog way, let's say, of extracting informations using our knowledge of optics, of perspective, just to point out that this kind of information extraction has always existed pre-digital era. And also a tiny anecdote. It's that the book, there's a label on the book, or in the back of the cover of the book, and it says that it is a gift from the United States government to the people of Finland. And there's one book called The Manual of Photogrammetry, and then the other book is called The Manual of Photo Interpretation, and both are published by the US and given to the people of Finland as a friendly gesture. So that's also like one extra piece of information from the story.
Thank you from my side too. I just want to, there are a couple of comments on the chat. Thank you for the presentation from Chad and from Ron, he's a professional forester in Alberta in Canada, and he finds the work fascinating in many levels. I was wondering also, like, if you could expand a little bit more on like the purpose of the model that Daniel has built, on the like original, let's say, purpose of that model, and what's like the scientific, let's say, purpose of all their practices in the forest with these imagining techniques, and how do they use those models on the scientific field? Because I guess that with you have seen like a more of a poetical and maybe photographical point of view, but I will like to learn a little bit more of how they use those representations and that data.
Yeah, I have to first preface this by saying I'm not a scientist, although I worked 2 years with them and really interviewed them about their method. From how I know, from what I understand, the model that they developed, they're mapping the spectrum physical, the relations between the light, the signal that created, and the different physical structure and spectral properties of trees. So once they developed through measurement and connecting what is observed on the ground and what is collected in the satellite data, then the model is almost like a conversion table for me, which is like how in photo interpretation you can convert the crown size the aerial view from an aerial photograph to the size of the actual tree. You can also, and that's kind of more a metaphor, that you can also interpret from the signals, the hyperspectral signals that the satellite images contain, to, let's say, to infer like the physical structure of a tree. So it's a conversion table that help you make educated guess about what cannot be resolved, or what the resolution limit, because the resolution limit is invisible on the image, not just on the image, but also on the data level, that is not visible on the data level.
Thanks a lot. And yeah, I also wanted to say thanks to Ron. I'm really happy that we have a professional forester. I think that's also a great, like an extra validation from somebody from the field. One of the things that also caught me was that there was this sentence that I noted down, like, I was looking at an image, he was building a model, right? So it also kind of really looks at these two different ways of seeing the world, or using these technologies of seeing to have to create something completely different. And going back to this idea of information, I think the difference, and maybe that's also what's interesting to talk about, the difference between the military origins of information through photographic reconnaissance, and now is this idea of prediction, right? That there's a different temporality now, that this sort of scanning and this satellite is not seeing, but it's actually creating the things that it cannot see, right? That paradox was like something that I was like getting a bit of a headache. How does it work?
Yeah, I think you mentioned a really good point about prediction, and we build models to predict. And I actually want to talk more about the making of the models itself, because a lot of the ground truth measurement, why scientists should go to the forest to measure it themselves, is because we believe on-site observation is the more reliable data than remote sensing data that you get from the satellite images. So that's why people use go to the field to measure things, to validate data that is collected remotely. And at some point, the model, it's a way, I see it as a way of the human is kind of slowly going in the background. So at some point, if we validate the data and we have a vigorous model, then we don't even need to go there to know. Then we can predict what is there instead of going and seeing there. So there's this interesting, for me, there's this interesting way about observations, how observations, it's kind of becoming post-human in a sense. Maybe that's not the best word for it, but the human, we're trying to develop ways where the human can be taken out of the act of observations. So models and all these sensors can like kind of work it in itself and becomes.
So you're saying that there's no more need of the human intervention to validate the model.
I think that is maybe one of the end goal is that once we have enough ground truth measurements and we can scale it up to all these sensory data that we have, and then eventually we don't have to every time go there. But then that's also really interesting too. There's this for me, when is the human not needed, and when do we kind of put all this trust in these sensory data and models and mathematical, let's say, models? So what the tension between the human observer and then the supposedly theoretically correct models? When do we choose one and the other? And when do we kind of start privileging one over the other? It's interesting for me in this project.
Absolutely.
And we have a question on the chat. Ben is asking if the animals, birds, etc., are also scanned and included in the data. I guess that as long as they don't move, they will be scanned, which also brought me to think that like any moving thing, I guess that is understood as noise, as a disturbance. So there's also something interesting going on there with movement and with time, I guess. But I mean, maybe going back to Ben's question, are like these animals being scanned?
No, as far as I know, as far as I know, they're not being scanned, and that is interesting because that means the living creatures in the forest kind of become noise in the scanned data. Although I would say they are mostly interested, the research is mostly focused on photosynthetic surfaces and leaves and density of a forest and trees. And the spectrum that is used for the research is mostly more useful to detect photosynthetic surfaces than animals and birds and moving things. So that, yeah, but then they're not scanning animals and birds in the research project.
All right. I also want to mention, I think, no, I'm not sure if you mentioned it, that also ground truth. I mean, it's a project that you've been working on for several years, right? But you also recently released a book, which is available, or?
Yes, I recently released a book of the same title called Ground Truth, and it's published by Sky Connection, the Dutch publisher Sky Connection, and yeah, you can get them. And it's I work with graphic designer Emery Norton on the project, and yeah, I have to say I included documentary photographies, and it's interweaved with archival data, archival photographs from the Finnish Forest Museum, and then the data set that the scientists gave me. And I'm pretty proud of that book because somehow Emery and I found a way to work all these different materials, visual materials together and make it a cohesive book. So
yes, so we encourage all of you to go and check it out and order it. And John just sent the link in the chat, and if not, you can find it on Sheung Yiu's website. Yes, one more question from the chat coming in from Ron again. To link the question about birds, we have often looked at the forest from the ground up, and even with remote sensing, aerial photos to the current heads up 3D view. Our view of a forest canopy is not well understood. Seeing the forest from the top down might provide a different view, and even why some bird species prefer some forest compositions over others. Do you have anything
It's really good
to say about that? Like, is there any connection to the wildlife, maybe in your next project, Sean? You're expanding.
I was thinking, I'm really happy that there's a professional forester in this talk. And maybe that's a possible. I'll go back to. I'll chat with the researchers. We still keep in touch, so I'll tell them. What about birds? Maybe
it would be interesting also to share a little bit more about this collaboration with the researchers, especially I think it's obvious also by the footage and the images that you show that it's been a project that has gone on for now more than 5 years, if I remember correctly, and going
like
between
4 years, yeah.
So going between the library and the field work, and that's also a very interesting way of working that I think it's quite interesting in terms of combining your role as a visual artist and a researcher. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, I like to think of myself as knocking on people's door and ask them what they're doing, because I'm a doctoral researcher at Aalto in the photo program, but I'm interested in looking at different ways of new ways of visualizing and making images. So even though I'm in a photo program, I want to expand the notions of photography outside of just like cameras and what's in front of us. So I often kind of knock on researchers' door who is working on similar subjects, who's working on image making, but with a very different intentions and with different technology, and just ask them how that works, and then try to reflect on my own practice as a photographer and also as someone who's interested in new media, what that means in terms of networked image, in terms of circulation of images, in terms of what images can do for us. So that it's a huge part of what I'm interested in, knocking on people's door and then looking back at the history of what they're doing and how is it connected to, let's say, photography.
And that's like a quite similar interest that we have on Skinworks too. I think it's a nice connection. I see a comment by Dennis on the chat now saying that I was fascinated in Skinwork and that has a copy of Ground Truth. And this was a great introduction.
A fan.
Yeah, a fan, definitely. Dennis says that he's interested on your Para Images project, which seems like a complementary topic. That he's doing an MFA on photography and is also retired librarian. So was intrigued by your book labeled Story. Books which circulate to students and library users carry their own stories and traces of the people whose hands have held them. So I guess that there's like a connection between this approach to books and your projects as well.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. Just to give a little bit more context, Para Image is kind of my master thesis. And in the book, basically, I traced 7 images of water splashes, from the drawing of Da Vinci's to Harold Eckington's famous photograph of like New Coronet, and to water simulations, the fluid simulations that you can easily do by any kind of 3D, like contemporary 3D software. I'm interested in why we are kind of obsessed with capturing this kind of ethereal phenomena. And yeah, I made a book just simply talking about these 7 images and what the different technical apparatus and machines that we use to make them, and how are they reflecting on our way of, how are they changing our way of seeing the world and just vision and visualizing techniques in general.
That's great, and I think, I mean, that's a lot to explore there. It looks to me like you have this fascination, this curiosity that is both, you know, between the artistic and scientific way of interpreting the world through images, which is particularly relevant and important in contemporary image society. So make sure to check it out. Get the book as well. No, it's not available, but you can request a digital copy, I think, to Sheung himself. If there's no other questions or no other pitches, we have, okay, more thank you from the chat. Then I would wrap up here today's screen walk and thank everyone who joined today, everyone on Twitch, and everyone being you, Sheung, who did this wonderful performative lecture for us.
Yeah, thank you from my side too. And thank you to everyone who has joined. I just want to remind everyone that we'll have another skill walk in 2 weeks on March 23rd with Azahara Cerezo. And I want to invite everyone to join us. Thank you again, Sheung, and thank you to all the people who has joined us tonight.